Video games are weird, you know that? Not just in the games themselves, but the entire industry. From the development companies drawing up the initial planning stages to the publishers that may or may not be handing out the funding to those plans, and even in the final or cancelled product itself. There is no shortage of oddities that can go on in this process. But I feel like that kind of adds to the mystique of this industry that we all love, tolerate, despise, depending on who you ask. Regardless of how you feel about the current state of affairs though, you can't deny that this has caused some interesting bits of history that have gone down in the books, especially when talking about the history of fates of some of these companies. That leads me to one particular Japanese company that I've always found utterly fascinating. Not just because of their output, which I've really enjoyed, but also because of all the insanity that occurred inside and outside of their power, the highs and lows that they reached, and the fact that they're still somehow alive today after 44 years of twists and turns that I've seen put down other studios. So allow me to take you through this company's chain of events. A company today that's recognized by 3 letters and a certain jingle. The year is 1978, and the stage is Osaka, Japan. Someone very important to the story that we'll come back to later starts the company that'll later become SNK. Although for a few years this company will be known by its full name instead of the iconic abbreviation, Shin Nihon Kikaku, which when translated means New Japan Project. Sounds kind of like something sinister, but in reality it was merely a company that noticed the upward trend in this whole arcade thing, and wanted a piece of that pie. Very perceptive by these guys, because 1978 would also see the release of some random game called Space Invaders, which I heard did pretty okay and helped the arcade business grow a little. Not that important. With dollar, or I guess in this case yen, signs in their eyes, Shin Nihon Kikaku went to work to make their debut for the world to witness. Not just a game, surprisingly, but a cabinet table, which was known as the Mekon Kit. And what games could be played on such cutting-edge arcade technology? Breakout. Look, cut them some slack, it was 1978. It's either this or games that looked like this. Here's a weird fact for you though. This Breakout clone you're currently looking at is actually called Uchu Senkan Yamato. Any anime aficionados will have recognized that name as the popular space adventure franchise. So not only did Shin Nihon Kikaku want to cash in on that arcade craze, but they also wanted some of that sweet anime crossover yen. And I mean, if you injected yourself with mysterious substances a couple times, you could probably see the resemblance. Yamato, Hashin! Probably. But enough of Anime Breakout, you probably want to hear about the original SNK catalog, no licensed stuff. Well, that can be found in 1979 with the next title with the company's name slapped on it, Ozma Wars, a game notable for being the second with vertical orientation, and the first that had these things called levels. From this point on, Shin Nihon Kikaku really went on a streak of improvements and innovations, continuing to break ground in this new uncharted land of video games with titles like Fantasy in 1981, which was the first arcade game to have a continue feature, and it also had Funky Town in it, really. Huh. Also in 1981 was Vanguard, which was both the first shoot-'em-up that had 4-directional shooting, and when it was ported over to the Atari 2600 in 1983, it became the first home cartridge to have a continue option. There was a lot more that was done during these early years, like 1985's TNK3, or just Tank, in Japan, which introduced SNK's longest recurring character in Ralph Jones, making him older than industry icons like Link, Simon Belmont, or Mega Man. But obviously I'm not here to just spew facts at you and go over every single game SNK's made, because this video would be much too long and much too tedious. This is a studio that's been a part of over 400 titles. Just trying to get the message through that this was a trailblazing group here, and such action was met with a well-deserved amount of success in Japan. They became so successful, in fact, that it was decided by the higher-ups that it was time to expand outside of Japan, which would necessitate a name change. Shin Nihon Kikaku. Yeah, that isn't exactly something that rolls off the tongue easy for anybody outside of Japan. So, in 1986, with some letters removed, the company was newly christened as SNK.
No.
Well, they tried to do that, but at the time, Japanese law didn't allow companies to register their trade names if it was just an acronym in Romanji lettering. So, SNK Corporation Limited was finally born. Outside of the name change though, there wasn't all that much different about the company. There was a bit of a philosophy shift with the company now putting more focus into software development, but otherwise this was still the same steadily growing group of innovators. The one SNK fact that you've probably heard of has to do with the 1987 Psycho Soldier, and that was the first game to have a song with vocals in it. Sure, it sounded like
God, it's all toilet sounds.
But again, baby steps here, people. This was the 80s, and video game hardware had a good chance of bursting into flames if you asked it to emit voices.
Please, 17 ball.
More importantly to the company around this time, though, was that they finally managed to score that first worldwide hit. A massive hit in the United States, Japan, and even the United Kingdom, this cabinet was a staple of mid to late 80s arcades. That can be credited to its fun co-op run-and-gun gameplay, and these cabinets introducing the world to rotary joysticks. Now, it was first used in the previously mentioned TNK3, but Ikari is what put the stick and SNK on radars for the first time. The game didn't stop at the arcades either. This is one of those titles that got ported to almost every home console and computer available at the time, which began turning the gears towards another shift in SNK, as their gaze started to focus in on yet another trend in the gaming landscape, which was beginning to take shape.
Well, video games fever has prompted a number of businesses to try to cash in on that billion-dollar craze.
As the 80s wore on, the arcades were remaining a lucrative prospect, as SNK could now expect a hit or two each year as they put out titles like Ikari sequels or Beast Busters, but the men in suits were more than aware of the steam that was building up in the home console market, especially after seeing all the green brought in from the NES port of Ikari Warriors. This led to the development of their first two games built specifically for home consoles, Baseball Stars and Crystalis, which both went on to critical and financial success. With tons of capital to play with in their possession, over a decade of development and publishing experience, along with a now recognizable brand in their arsenal, it was time for SNK to head into the 90s with a big move. This move took them back to the arcades for a bit. If you somewhat know your SNK history, you're probably expecting me to talk about an expensive big black brick right now, but actually SNK didn't originally have plans to throw their hat into the home console battlefield. They did put their money back into hardware production, but in 1990 the only thing that came to the general public was that lovely red box, the Neo Geo MVS. This thing is going to take us on a quick detour because I can't talk about this company, and especially the MVS, without mentioning one of the more unexpected turns it took. A spoiler for the future of this company, but that previous success that I talked about earlier in the US and UK wasn't something that was sustained. SNK has managed to keep a foothold in the Eastern Asian countries, but being pigeonholed like that can be unsustainable for a company, especially as one as big as SNK was in the 90s. So who's the other major market that's kept them afloat all these years? Hola. In what sounds like something out of a Mad Libs answer, SNK surprisingly becomes absolutely massive in Mexico and South America of all places. But how did SNK's games suddenly start appealing to the tastes of the Spanish-speaking people? Well, I mean, they did start getting much better around this time, which I'll get to shortly, but this was more of a case of cost and availability. We're just cracking into the 90s now, which means gaming as a whole is about to experience another surge in popularity. Some at home, sure, but this became especially prevalent in the arcades. This was the peak, people. You had so many companies coming out of the woodworks here, dropping arcade classic after arcade classic. This growth in competition necessitated advancements in cabinet technology, and those tech upgrades necessitated a bigger bill for the facilities that wanted these quarter-jacking machines. If you could afford it, this was nothing but a net positive for your place, but not everywhere could afford these new cabinets, even if they were tearing it up in other areas of the globe. That would include many facilities in still developing countries, something that Mexico and most places in the southern continent can attest to. So, if you don't find it financially viable to buy a singular item at a premium cost, one move you could make is securing multiple high-quality products for a lower cost, but surely nothing out there could... Hello! The MVS Multi-Video System Cabinets. Distinct, cheap to produce, home to a ton of great games, and if you were like me and grew up in an Asian country, or not like me and grew up in a mid-South American country, these things were everywhere. Not to say that they didn't have any presence in the US or Europe, they did, but you gotta understand. It wasn't just the arcades in other countries. If you walked into a laundromat, grocery store, gas station, doesn't matter. Wherever you went, those MVS cabinets were always following.
Now, repeat after me. You will not go back to the King of Fighters.
Hey, dude! Wanna play some King of Fighters?
But why, you may be wondering. I mean, taking a first glance at these things, they don't appear to look that much cheaper than, say, a Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat cabinet. These things even have multiple games to choose from. They must be more, or at least somewhat close to equal in cost. Well, it's all about what's on the inside. Back in ye olden days of arcade cabinets, when you built one, it was strictly for whatever game was being made. Once created, there was no swapping of titles, unless the machine was sent back to the manufacturer or landed in the hands of someone very familiar with the new tech at the time and a conversion kit. This was a viable system to work with, until arcades started getting really big in the late 80s. That's when you started to see companies like Capcom develop new arcade system boards to help mitigate rising hardware demand and maintenance costs. Their labor brought about the CP system. These boards would allow you to swap titles in and out as you pleased. You just needed to swap out the cartridge. The extremely gargantuan, very expensive cartridges that were placed onto a board that could only hold one at a time. SNK, more specifically Takashi Nishiyama, who had just come from Capcom after working on some games called Street Fighter and Mega Man, took a look at this and said, yeah, that's pretty cool, but I think we could make something even more convenient. So that became their primary goal once MVS cabinets started to be developed. Let's make machines with less bits and bobs on the inside and focus more on something more compact and versatile. This is how you end up with a cabinet that's surprisingly hollow on the inside, save for the screen, speakers, and most importantly, this little box that could hold anywhere from 1 to 6 cartridges depending on the model. Said cartridges being much more affordable and only slightly bigger than VHS tape. This would be the machine that would truly make SNK a brand known worldwide, with significantly higher notoriety in Japan, China, Central America, and pretty much all of South America. I mean, why spend a bundle to get those games dominating the US when you could instead get a cabinet with more games for significantly less? Getting those seeds planted in those markets isn't just how SNK finally got their name out there to the rest of the world, it also allowed them to maintain it, as MVS cabinets continue to get support for an absurd 14 goddamn years. For comparison's sake, the CP system, which I mentioned previously, would be swapped out for newer CP systems after like 3 to 5 years. Which was done to fight back against bootleg cartridges, something that SNK didn't seem to care about nearly as much. I'm sure anyone who played with a couple MVS cabinets ended up stumbling upon at least one that was loaded up with a bootleg cartridge that had like 300 games on it. Bad for SNK's business, but great for the customer. I love those things. Oh, and speaking of games, it's probably time to get into why people even bothered to keep coming back to these cabinets in the first place. Okay, here we go. If you know SNK, this is why. This time period right here is where SNK was on fire. Not only was this company developing and publishing games at light speed, there were so many. They weren't just good, they were great. They were certified classics. And so many different genres too. Neo Turf Masters, Polestar, Twinkle Star Sprites. No, seriously, that game is awesome. And I want to give a personal shout out to Top Hunter. That game does not get nearly enough love. One of the best games SNK ever made in my books. But of course, as good as those games are, the true money makers were uncovered when SNK, and once again more specifically Takashi Nishiyama, brought out their big three. Fatal Fury in 1991, The King of Fighters in 1994, and Metal Slug in 1996. I was close to calling this a big four and including Samurai Showdown, but that franchise was only big for a bit while the other three had absolutely massive success that they sustained for much longer. So have this consolation prize instead, Sam Show. You're still awesome. These three are what would take SNK to the height of its popularity, introducing characters that are known by just about everyone, except Smash players apparently, pushing sprite work to new levels, and just generally being really damn good video games. And when you produce such a catalog, the next thought on the mind of most is, man, I wish I could play these at home. And, well, SNK was already ahead of you there, because back in 1990, SNK would release their first console with the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System. Don't go looking for them in the store yet though, because the only place this console is being released is to hotels and bars as a rental. Yeah, for the first year of its existence, this console wasn't a home console and instead limited mostly to expensive Japanese hotels as a luxury item. The reason for this is that the console was not cheap to produce due to the horsepower it had within when you compare it to the other consoles of that generation. The upsides with this thing were plain to see. I mean, do you guys want to play games at home that are just like their arcade counterparts? Do you guys want to experience the most cutting-edge technology 4th gen consoles can provide? Do you guys want to pay $649.99 for this thing, along with games that retailed at $200 to $300, which when adjusted to 2024 money means dropping about $2,000 for the console plus one game?
Oh no.
This is why the Neo Geo was a very niche system. More of a collector's item nowadays, and to SNK's credit, they knew this and originally planned to just keep it to hotel items. But there was enough demand from these loaded guests for SNK to release the console publicly, albeit with much smaller quantities produced compared to what the other home console companies were putting out. This resulted in the Neo Geo only selling a bit more than 1 million units over its lifespan, but since only a limited amount was made, it having such a high price and most importantly using the exact same cartridges as MVS cabinets, meaning no cost had to go towards making ports for the thing, it was still a massive financial success. Neo Geo even got itself a CD version so you could get these games at a much cheaper price. Just, don't ask about the console price or the loading times. So you've done it, Mr. SNK. You really did it. You went from making little breakout tables in Japan to a global force in the gaming realm. Arcade and home money is flooding in. The games are for the most part fantastic, anime adaptations from multiple franchises. You've even got your own SNK branded arcades with bowling alleys and cafes. Congratulations, you have properly hit the mountaintop. Now have fun falling off of it. The good times for SNK were still kind of rolling around this time, for game quality at least. I mean, this is when we still got more greats like Metal Slug 3, KOF 98, and Garo, the first two arguably being the most popular games SNK has ever made. But as much as they're loved, do you know what they also are? Safe and familiar. While today's gaming publishers hang on to those two words harder than a childhood security blanket made out of money, that wasn't the case in the late 90s to early 2000s. Things in the gaming hemisphere were changing rapidly, and while there are of course other factors to play for the decline of any company, I'd attribute the downfall of SNK to 3 major factors.
Oh no, my arcade.
SNK had built themselves a most beautiful throne in the realms of gorgeous 2D games in the arcade with a focus on the fighting genre, which is a really nice way of saying they were pigeonholing the hell out of their output and were very, very vulnerable to any shifts in the landscape. But this is arcades and 2D games we're talking about. They'll always be popular and beloved. Whoa, seems like the pockets are getting a little less heavy here. Hey arcades, could you lay SNK here another golden egg?
Dead.
Ooh, right. Around this time is when arcades, particularly in the West, started their rapid decline in relevance and attention from other video game companies, as they shifted more towards home and mobile game development. Video games were now expected to be less arcade-like and more complete experiences worth your money. This means higher development costs, this means longer games, and most importantly, this meant following the hottest trend at the time.
The third dimension becomes a thing.
Oh good, I bet you haven't heard this one before. Did you know that video game companies had a hard time transitioning to 3D? Well yeah, it's been overplayed at this point, but it was still something that happened, especially if your staff wasn't too familiar with 3D. The MVS cabinets, Neo Geo, and its CD counterpart were such pieces that weren't equipped for the future that was careening towards them. They had no 3D capabilities. This meant that SNK had to adjust, and that starts with a new arcade board that you could possibly turn into a home console. That sounds solid enough. So, out with the MVS and Neo Geos. 1997 is going to be the year of the Hyper Neo Geo 64. Awesome name, had the ability to handle 3D, didn't even get out of Japan, and it got ditched after 2 years because it was such an expensive flop. MVS cabinets were cool, but one thing I neglected to mention was that a major reason it got supported for so long was because SNK was backpedaling from this money sink. The saddest part of all is that in the 2 years of life this thing had, it only got 7 games made for it. And I'd bet good money that the only 2 games you may have heard from this are Fatal Fury Wild Ambition, after it got ported to the PlayStation, and Mercury 1 in Google searches so people could find out who the hell those 2 guys in KOF 11 were. Don't need a crystal ball to tell you that going from almost no 3D games under your belt to trying to compete with Tekken and DOA is not going to go very well. Doubly so when you're trying to compete with them only in the arcade side of things, which is currently beginning to crumble. Triply so when you abandon everything that made the MVS a success. You know, cheaper maintenance and development costs, the ability to house multiple games, all that given up just so you can throw your hat in this losing competition. I don't know what they were thinking of releasing an overpriced gaming machine with almost no exclusive games over the span of years just so you can stay up to date. It's not a winning formula, and it never will be.
Where did all the money go?
SNK, you need to put the champagne down now and pick your balls up off the floor because the cash flow is falling across the board and it ain't 1995 anymore. How are you going to save this gaming company? The f*** you mean you built an amusement park? Neo Geo Land is kind of one, but that was more like a high-end arcade. I'm seeing advertisements here for haunted houses, actual nightmare inducers, oh my god, those are horrifying, indoor roller coasters, Ferris wheels. How is this supposed to help the video games, man? Okay, let me be fair here. Maybe the park becomes a big success and funds future games. Just don't lose money on it and give up after 2 years like you did with the Hyper Neo Geo 64, alright? Have you considered maybe just committing to being a third-party video game developer at this point instead of wasting all this money on this crap? Or at the very least, make one more console that you could take home. Maybe you could bow out of the console race with some classics like Sega did with the Dreamcast. That's not what I meant! Yay, the Neo Geo Pocket. Do you kids remember this one? If you answer yes, you are either a liar or Japanese, because nobody outside of those 2 groups remembers this thing. I guess SNK at this time wasn't just satisfied with blowing money on 3D arcade machines and the amusement parks that housed them. Might as well go for the trifecta and get your teeth kicked in by Nintendo on the mobile game front too. Now, it would be unfair to be completely negative with this thing. It did have some pretty good games on it, it was priced reasonably, and it did have a 40-hour battery life, which was really impressive. But as you can imagine, it got stomped on by the Game Boy, didn't make it out of Japan, and was discontinued, but after a whole 1 year this time. I didn't know SNK was innovating again. They would give the mobile gaming market one more crack with the Neo Geo Pocket Color, but it would just meet the same fate as every other SNK project around this time. 2 years, then dropped. So let me extend you another congratulations, SNK. Thanks to your over-reliance on the arcade scene, failed push into 3D game development, and multiple failed projects, you have successfully pissed away over 20 years of build and are now 38 billion yen in debt. Normally I'd say that death via bankruptcy awaits, but Y2K has something special for you. It'll have you wishing you were dead. Have you heard the news? Bankruptcy is almost here. For most video game companies, that means it's time for a good old session of layoffs, liquidations, and selling of assets. But as we've established so far, SNK is not like most video game companies. It's late 1999, SNK higher-ups are deciding what to do with their limited time left, but then a hand is shockingly offered to them, and what they're saying sounds just too good to be true. That hand was offered by a company very aptly named a Ruse Corporation. At the time, they would later rebrand to Universal Entertainment. No, not that one. There you go. Who would later then plant a Ruse branches around the globe. This was a pachinko company with deep pockets at the time, and while I was originally going to label them as outright villains, I found out while researching for this video that in between a sea of pachinko and slot machines, they also published the Shadowheart games. So I can't completely hate these guys. I love those games, and they wouldn't be here if it weren't for this company, so fair's fair. I won't paint this company as serial killers, but merely incompetent scam artists with an offer. The offer they gave to SNK was a promise for financial backing to help them get back on their feet. No firings or liquidations needed to be done by SNK. The band could stay together. All they needed in return was merely complete ownership and control of every single thing SNK owned.
It's good!
Now, you can probably guess where this story is going to go, but I don't think you'd expect just how fast it was before the true intentions of a ruse were shown. Here's your time frame. The buyout was announced in January of 2000. A ruse announced that SNK was about to die and were prepping to sell all their assets at the end of October in 2001. They did not even wait for the ink to dry on that contract before making changes. Any branches of SNK outside of Japan? Closed. Staff? Well, they kept to their word. SNK didn't have to fire anybody, but a ruse sure did, and if you weren't fired, you were like Takashi Nishiyama and got the hell out of there because you could see clear as day what was about to happen. The directions were as follows. Finish any games currently under development, and after that, a ruse couldn't give two shits about what happened to the people of SNK. They just wanted the IPs to either slap them on pachinko machines, let other studios handle them, or sell them off for cash. If you were ever wondering why SNK did less developing and more publishing of games around this time, this is why. SNK was little more than a skeleton at this point, and a ruse was just there to pick off any bits of meat left before discarding them. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there was someone very important to this entire tale, and I saved it for now because his role is about to massively ramp up. Allow me to introduce you to the founder of SNK, the one and only Eikichi Kawasaki. Now, if you were to imagine someone who would found a major video game development company, you would think that maybe he was a computer engineer, maybe a big Pong fan, or I don't know, maybe he's just a suit who's already got a lot of experience running high-level operations. Our man Eikichi here ran a coffee shop. He also ran a construction business on the side and was apparently a former boxer too. Couldn't find out if that last bit was true, but I hope to God it is. He's the one who invested in an unknown electric manufacturing company that he would dub Shin Nihon Kikaku. And he did this back in 1973, however the company wasn't properly established and registered until 1978. So not only was this man here for SNK since the start, he was there before the start. Everything I've mentioned up to this point, the ups and downs, had Eikichi watching. Not always in the background, mind you, he was usually found in the credits of SNK games as the executive producer, although he does have a couple director credits in a couple early SNK titles, and he's even the guy who wrote up the lyrics for the historic Psycho Soldier track. Very talented man, and one that is apparently not to be messed with. Like I said earlier, there were many people in SNK who jumped ship shortly after the deal with Aruse was done because they knew what was about to happen. Eikichi was one of them, and once free, he could do whatever he wanted. Maybe he found himself a new video game company and start making games similar to what was made before. We've seen that play out many times now. Maybe start a business in an entirely different field. He seems like a guy who could be successful wherever he liked. Or, you know what, just retire, man. You're not getting any younger, and you've got the money secured. Mr. Kawasaki instead chose vengeance with a 7-step plan. First off, Eikichi rounded up the executive boys and dumped money into a short-lived development studio called Brezasoft, which was entirely made up of released SNK talent, and they were first put to work on KOF 2001 and 2002, to ensure they didn't end up like the mess KOF 2000 turned out to be. Plus, they wanted to keep tabs on this Korean company called Eolith that was given the keys to the IP by Aruse. Second, Eikichi and his group founded a second company you may have heard of called Playmore. Third, the moment Aruse puts the SNK properties up for sale, immediately snatch up every single one you can get, even down to the damn name. Fourth, in the biggest power move of 2002, start suing the hell out of Aruse for using any SNK characters right after the IP purchases were made. Doesn't matter if it's a game or a pachinko machine, if Terry Bogard is there, you are violating his owned copyright. Fifth, take those 3 letters and slap them over Playmore in 2003. This is officially SNK Playmore now. 6. Have the Osaka court rule in favor of SNK Playmore, meaning that Aruse has to pay out 6.2 billion yen in damages. And finally, use that money to fund more games and acquire any companies comprised of ex-SNK employees, like Brezasoft. Now free of debt, with the boys mostly returned and Aruse out of the way, the newly formed SNK Playmore moves towards the future unshackled. Oh, and one last note before the next segment. That company, Aruse, well, a future of more lawsuits, court dates, bankruptcy, and then a closure of their American branch in 2023 awaits. Again, Eikichi is not to be messed with. Once SNK was reborn, things were weird for a bit once the millennium kicked off. You start off this period with a massive slowdown in games released by the company. You still have your annual KOFs and biannual Metal Slugs in the earlier part of the decade, which understandable as the company is getting their bearings back, but then in 2004 there's no mainline KOF game. Instead, you have SNK Playmore working on their own pachinko machines and taking another crack at a 3D fighter, which resulted in
KOF Maximum Impact.
Okay, I have plenty of feelings about those games, by the way, but I'm going to save them for another video. Okay, so this SNK is properly embracing the future, you may be thinking. As much as I'll miss them, it seems like the industry is still pushing hard for 3D games at this point, so now we're seeing SNK move away from sprites, and nope, 2005, big SNK releases, KOF 11, Samsho 6 in Japan only, and Neo Geo Battle Coliseum. All sprite games. It's this strange era that's a mishmash of the future and past that feels kinda directionless to me, like You guys keep releasing all these compilation titles, remakes, and sprite-based games, but shortly after that we'll get something like another Maximum Impact title. In 2006, there was even a 3D and a 2D Metal Slug, and that's not even mentioning all the other stuff around the major releases. There were a lot of mobile games and pachinko machines made during this time frame, and the stuff that didn't fall in either camp was just the weirdest shit, man.
これはすごいね、ちょっと。やめてください。
SNK, buddy, I'm not against this. You know, do what you want. But are you alright? Is this even profitable? A lot of games you're making right now seem extremely niche. Do you even want to rise back up to the heights you were in the 90s, or are you just happy being this quirky Japanese dev that makes a bunch of niche titles? By this point, it had been 4 years since the last mainline KOF game, and I remember wondering at the time if they were just done with 2D KOF at this point. I mean, I would get it, the only fighting games around this time that were still doing well were the 3D ones. But, I mean, we did just get this game called Street Fighter IV that really seemed to re-spark a desire for 2D fighters. But what I didn't know was that SNK was far from done with it. In fact, they'd been cooking up something since 2006 that was meant to be the ultimate 2D fighting game. Everything since the revival had been leading up to this thing, and boy did it not pay off in the slightest.
The King of Fighters 12.
KOF 12. Now, I know every fighting game has its fans, but I would like to think that I'm not hurting too many feelings here when I say this is the worst KOF game and it's not even close. I've brought the series up in this video multiple times, but if you aren't familiar with SNK's biggest product, let me just give you the skinny on it. If you're playing KOF, it's probably for 3 reasons: the 3v3 team system, the challenging but fun gameplay, and the massive rosters. The only aspect this game doesn't fail at is the first point, and it doesn't even land that basic concept correctly because this game doesn't have any official teams, or story, or anything. Even SNK knew that. This title is the only game in the mainline series that isn't considered a dream match, and it's not considered canon either to the franchise plot. It just feels bare bones, like it isn't finished. And that's because it is unfinished. I know this is an odd question to ask, especially considering that video game development philosophy has changed so much over the years, especially recently, but how can a game with about 4 years of dev time still come out so undercooked? Well, you've been looking right at the culprit this entire time, and that's a real damn shame because, as you can clearly see, this game is beautiful. Like, dude, we are coming up on 15 years since this game came out, and I am still blown away by this sprite work. Look at these animations, look at the characters, look at these backgrounds, man. It is immaculate, and I know some of you guys prefer the more realistic looks of Tekken or Mortal Kombat, or the stylized looks of a Guilty Gear or Street Fighter, but to me, personally, this is the peak of fighting game graphics, I gotta admit. And I also gotta admit this is why the game suffered so much. If you want a game to look this good, you need to put the time and work in, I understand that. But I think there's a point when it's too much time, too much work, to the point where it isn't worth it anymore. Masaki Kukino, the producer for this and KOF 13, has stated that each character took at least 16 months to complete, along with the manpower of 10 individuals. That's just not a feasible development system, at least not for KOF, not for SNK. I get wanting to have this level of graphical fidelity when you're shooting for the ultimate 2D fighter, but when it comes at the cost of gameplay systems, the loss of multiple fan favorites and mainstays, the fact that you have to push out this unfinished product out the door just so you can recoup some of the insane development costs and hit your hopes on a sequel that may fix the problems, you've got a major malfunction in the studio. And it just sucks, because if this game were merely just as bad as it is, I'd crack a quick joke about it or ignore it entirely. There were plenty of games I could have ragged on that I skipped over because the end result was a harmless, bad game. But KOF 12 wasn't harmless. This is the catalyst for what I'd consider the second death of SNK. KOF 13 is what should have come out, man. That was a good game. Not my favorite, as it plays quite different from other KOF games, but it was a healthy challenge, had a great look, and the roster was alright. But trying to win back an existing audience that just got burned a year ago from that which shall not be mentioned again, alienating potentially new audiences with tougher than usual gameplay, and a porous online functionality was just too many hurdles to overcome. The game did sell, but clearly not enough, and SNK would completely shift away from developing any arcade or console games, instead putting their efforts entirely into pachinko machines, slot machines, and mobile games. The development costs actually must have been that bad. I can't find any specific numbers, but this all points to a situation where SNK tried to bite off far more than they could chew and ended up suffering for it. If you're an SNK fan that was around for their first go at death, this is pretty much how things were expected to shake out if a ruse didn't come into the picture. Just void, and occasional reminders that the IPs somewhat still exist. You know, earlier in the video I took a little jab at Smash players for not knowing who Terry Bogard was when he got into Smash Ultimate because, you know, first reaction, that's ridiculous. How do you not know who he is? He is a gaming icon. But as I did more research into this company, wrote the script, and recalled my own memories, I've come to the realization that I can't really blame these people. I mean, the average age of your casual Smash fan is going to be in the ballpark of, let's say, 10 to 24 for a generous range. If you're in that age bracket, what is there to remember about this company? They're not old enough to be around during the peak, not even old enough for that odd first bankruptcy period where the company was sinking, but at least the MVS cabinets were still being supported. But what's notable about SNK after that? It's just an era of irrelevancy followed by absolute silence for the first half of the 2010s. That's not a good way to establish any kind of presence in the mind of a modern audience. 2016, however, would prove to be the next turning point. Something very interesting happened this year, and I remember being pretty worried when the news first broke. SNK Playmore was being purchased for a good amount of money by a Chinese mobile game company that were interested in gaining the rights to SNK's IPs. Also, said company was in the chicken business just a few years back. That last bit was new, but overall this sounded like a song and dance I'd already witnessed before, and Nikichi wasn't going to be able to bail them out this time if things went south, since this transaction included the purchase of all shareholder stakes he had in the company. I obviously wasn't glad that SNK was now this ghostly apparition that only made mobile and pachinko games now, but I was still of the mind that it would be better to go out on your own terms instead of being absorbed by somebody else. But then something nobody was expecting happened. SNK is dropping the Playmore part of their name just to be good old SNK again, huh? Well, it's a nice gesture of a return to our roots, but still, whatever. Call me when SNK stops making... Oh... They aren't making pachinko machines anymore, and they're going to be making console games again, really? Oh, wow, that sounds great, but hey, temper those expectations. I'll believe it when I see it. Oh, wow. I can't believe it. Oh, look at that roster. It is so big, and like almost everyone is back. Almost. Well, the gameplay is reminding me of some good old days. And listen to those new remixes. And the graphics? Oh god, this game's actually looking kind of rough, but it's about the soul? Also, that netcode isn't all that great, but I'm sure they'll fix it in their next fighting game. This is a surprisingly solid comeback. SNK even said that they're happy with the sales of 14 and want to keep this going. What else do you have for me, a Neo Geo Mini? Oh, look at that. That's adorable. I'll take your entire stock. A new console, Metal Slug 2? Dude, I'm gonna play the hell out of that when that comes out in the next year or two. And Sam Show is coming back too. Look, dude, this is great. I cannot wait to play that when it releases on Steam. That netcode is sure to be godlike now. Oh man, was I being negative before? Yo, forget that. Never happened. The future is now, and my guy Terry Bogard just got into Smash Bros. Gino Who. If you don't know who this man is, you are an underage, stupid motherfucker. In short, I was pretty happy to see SNK get back on track during this time. That proverbial track certainly had some bumps along the road, to put it mildly, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like SNK was properly back under some spotlight. They certainly still aren't close to their peak years, but it does feel as though they have more eyes on them now compared to any other time post-2000. Unfortunately, SNK doesn't really release sales numbers all that often, except for the case of SNK Heroines, but I'm sure that's because they were as surprised as I was that shitpost game sold more than like 2 copies. But from what I can tell, these releases all did well enough to raise SNK's stock and keep them back in as home game devs. Well, alright then. Let's see where this last turn takes us. Another ownership change, huh? Oh boy, SNK, you must have a fetish for getting new owners, eh? I'm just messing. I know it's out of your control at this point, but getting bought out by a Chinese company for $60 million and then another one just 5 years later? That's pretty strange for a company of your stature. How much did you fetch this time? $430 million. Impressive. Look who's back on the rise. So, who bought you this time? Was it a Japanese company? American? Another Chinese? It feels like they're buying major shares in all game dev companies these days. Ooh, that's a beehive I'm not touching. Let's just briefly go over the last game you made instead.
KOF 15.
2022's King of Fighters 15. A great fighting game in my opinion. Looks much better than King of Fighters 14. Particle effects still could use a little bit of work. Plays better, canon to the franchise plot, and featuring a roster that I would say is second best in the series. I like me some Isla, but 2002 Ultimate Match will always have a special place in my heart. Still not doing sales numbers like Tekken or Street Fighter apparently, but considering how much you just got paid by your new overlords, it seems like things are trending upwards. Yeah, this seems to check all the boxes. So, where'd you mess up? Loved 14 and Sam Show, but those games had some problems. Primarily with the netcode. Let me see here. Oh, the netcode is solid here too, so... okay, I see. The matchmaking isn't working too well. Well, I mean, it happens to the best of games at launch. Just make sure you get it ironed out after, a couple weeks and we'll be all good. What do you mean you just fixed it? Do you know how long it's been? With finances now set for the foreseeable future, the rumblings from the company have now shifted. Less talks about trying to regain stability in this industry, and more about their future plans to start trying to get into big-time game development in the next decade. We're talking proper AAA titles, more high-profile spin-offs, and brand new IPs. And to that, all I can say is, best of luck to you guys. Hope you do well. We'll be supporting your next project. I'm very much looking forward to Gero 2. But I've seen your previous attempts of trying to move to the next level, and your track record hasn't been the most spotless. And there you have it, guys, from 1973 to 2023. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the trials and tribulations of this strange company. The gaming business is a fickle mistress that has knocked down many companies before for a multitude of reasons, but I can't recall many other studios that got knocked on their ass as much as SNK, but kept finding ways to get back up. Felt like this is a story worth sharing. So, again, SNK, this random guy wishes you nothing but success in the future. Just be a bit more cautious, okay? Don't know how many more chances you may get in this industry. Like your motto says, the future is now, so don't squander that future. And of course, I have to give my biggest thanks to you for making it this far into the video, and biggest apologies to anyone who was actually looking forward to me uploading something for, the past year. It's a desire I've already failed at before, but this time I really want this to be a proper start to some regular uploading on this channel. Unfortunately, that would not include those KOF 15 character guides anymore. Those burned me out pretty bad. I feel like it'd be better for both you and me if I just went back to making videos about the various gaming subjects that I want to talk about. If that sounds like a future you're interested in too, please like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And I should be seeing you guys again soon. Thank you again for watching. Please stay safe.